You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 1st of August 2025 on Monocle Radio. The Briefing in association with Addis. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. Coming up on today's programme,
we're taking in literally trillions of dollars for the country. This is making our country very rich and respected again.
Here we go again. US President Donald Trump restarts his trade war, but why are Canada and Brazil getting such extraordinary punishment? Also ahead, we'll find out why the prospect of trading around the US is not bringing the EU and China any closer together. Later in the show, why Portugal is becoming nearly as attractive to actual Portuguese as it is to everyone else. And we'll have some suggestions of what you could be reading this summer.
So this is a book to get in on the ground floor before the movie comes out because it's so much fun.
And we'll wrap up the talk of the catwalks in a fashion news roundup. That's all coming up right here on The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And welcome to today's edition of The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. It's Liberation Day again. The latest deadline for countries to come to terms with the tariff regime of US President Donald Trump has elapsed, triggering an imposition or increase of tariffs on exports to the US from all over the world. Among the headline figures, a hike from 25 to 35% on imports from Canada, 50% on imports from Brazil, 10% on imports from the Heard and McDonald Islands, where the chief penguin has proved a laggardly trade negotiator. Here is some of what President Trump had to say earlier.
No, I didn't like what they said, but, that's their opinion. I didn't like that. Not a deal breaker, but we haven't spoken to Canada today. He's called, and we'll see. But we have made a few deals today that are excellent deals for the country.
Well, I'm joined now by Paul Baldy, Europe correspondent at the Globe and Mail, and by Fernando Augusto Pacheco, Monocle's senior correspondent. Paul, let's come to you first. Is the lack of a deal or an agreement with Canada surprising? It did appear for a while that President Trump and the new Prime Minister Mark Carney were actually getting on all right.
I think what's surprising is that while Trump gave Mexico a 90-day kind of extension to negotiate an agreement, he didn't give Canada any extension at all. And I think Canadians might be a little bit surprised at that. But the fact that a deal hasn't been struck as of today, August 1st, I don't think is a huge surprise. I think these negotiations were dragging on, as they have been for all countries. Really, Trump has only physically signed one deal, and that's with the UK. So I'm not sure Canadians are so surprised that the negotiations have dragged on. And I think the 35% tariff that he's now imposed is also not really going to have that much of an impact because the vast majority of Canadian trade with the U.S. still goes through the Canada-U.S.-Mexico trade agreement, and Trump has not altered that. So as long as goods that trade with the U.S. are compliant with that agreement, they still enter the U.S. pretty much tariff-free, and that is, by some estimates, as much as 90% of Canada-U.S. trade. So for now, anyway, the impact has been a bit muted.
So is it possible, and it would not be the first time, of course, in Donald Trump's presidencies, that this is all being done and said more for effect than impact?
Oh, it's entirely all done for effect and impact because the excuse he's using is this whole fentanyl argument that he's used for months and months and months, which is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, he says that Canada has not done enough to crack down on fentanyl trade, illegal fentanyl trade into the U.S., when in fact, illegal fentanyl trade to the U.S. from Canada accounts for less than 1% of all seizures. Most of it comes out of Mexico. So that's kind of a non-starter argument. But, he has to have some excuse to impose these tariffs. So that's what he's done. And then, of course, we all know in the past he's gone on and on about annexing Canada, and that's gone nowhere. So for some reason, he still doesn't like his northern neighbor.
Fernando, let's bring you in at this point. Is it clear why Brazil is getting hammered like this? Because 50% is a huge tariff.
It is huge. And I think what's interesting about the Brazil case that In my view, it was very much a political decision by Trump because, as I've discussed in the show previously, Brazil is on a trade surplus with the US for the last, I believe, 14 years. So I think Trump really wanted to get involved in Brazilian politics. He is against the current trial the former president Jair Bolsonaro is having in the country. And that's also why the US implemented sanctions against our Supreme Court Judge Alexandre de Moraes, who is responsible for this trial. So it was a very different, unlike other countries perhaps, that was more on an economic basis. Perhaps Brazil's purely political because it doesn't make sense even for the American customer.
Just to follow that up, Fernando, I mean, it's easy to see, I think, how President Trump could take former President Bolsonaro's present predicament somewhat seriously. He is on trial for inciting a rabble to ransack the Capitol in an attempt to overturn an election, which may or may not remind President Trump of something, who knows. But how is this actually playing with the incumbent president in Brazil, President Lula, that is? Are people blaming him for this or blaming Trump? Because this will put a dent in Brazil's economy.
It will, but not as much as people think, because Brazil, unlike other countries in Central and South America, like Mexico or Colombia, were not so dependent on the U.S. economy. There's been a study that I read in the Brazilian paper that the impact will be about 0.6% of our GDP. Of course, it's a considerable number, but not huge. And there's another thing, and that's why it's kind of a victory for Lula, because besides defying Trump, he even gave an interview to the New York Times, a very rare interview talking about this. There's been 700 exemptions on the taxes. So, for example, oranges, plane maker Embraer, so they will not need to pay this 50%. So the US, I think, in a way, understood that, the price would be a lot for the American customers to pay, those things that they really need to buy from Brazil, because Brazil is an agricultural powerhouse. We sell a lot of our products abroad. So yes, there will be an impact. But as Lula said in his interview for the New York Times, no reason to be afraid. And I think he says that looking at the numbers, saying that even in the worst case scenario, the Brazilian economy will not implode because of that.
Paul, to come back to you, is that more or less the line that we expect Mark Carney to keep on taking? Because presumably over the last few months, so much damage has been done to that trade relationship that a lot of Canadians have accustomed themselves to not buying American anyway.
Well, yeah, but I mean, Carney's in a real bind here because, unlike Brazil, Canada is very, very dependent on the U.S. for trade. I mean, the vast majority of our trade is with the U.S. Canada has done a terrible job over the decades of trying to diversify its trade, of trying to find other markets. It really hasn't done that. It hasn't bothered to do that. And we have all kinds of barriers within our own country that restrict our trade. So, Carney's trying to focus on that, trying to say that he's going to hopefully try and kickstart the Canadian economy. But none of that's going to matter if they can't sort out their trade relationship with the United States and with Trump. And I think, it's a really good point that all of these tariffs that Trump is wielding around are really politically motivated. I mean, he's mad at Canada because they recognize Palestine, but he's not mad at the UK because they've done it. And, he gets Canada to drop his digital services tax, but he doesn't get the UK to do it. So, it doesn't make any sense. There's no rhyme or reason. And I kind of feel sorry for Carney in the bind he's in.
And Fernando, just finally, to bring this back to Latin America, Brazil is bearing the brunt of this, but is this damaging the US brand across Latin America? Because for obvious reasons, going back to the 60s, 70s and 80s, this is a somewhat dicey relationship between South America and the United States. Has it gone downhill again in recent months?
Of course, it is damaging. Perhaps not so in Argentina at the moment with Javier Milei. But I have to say something about Lula as well, because he's a center-left leader. I remember when Lula was in power, I believe for his first term, Bush was in power in the US, and nobody was expecting that. They had an excellent relationship. They were all very amicable in all the G20 meetings that they were there, of course with Obama. So in a way, it's quite sad to see the two biggest democracies in the continent, having this kind of weird spat. So yes, the image is damaged, and more surprisingly, among the right-wing spectrum in Brazil. This is terrible news for the Bolsonarismo movement next year, because even people from the right saying, hold on, they are actually plotting against our own country, against our own economy.
Fernando Augusto Pacheco and Paul Waldy, thank you both for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. Here is Laura Kramer with the day's other headlines.
Thanks, Andrew. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is calling for regime change in Russia after Moscow's latest drone attack on Kyiv killed at least 31 people. The strikes came despite President Trump warning of tougher U.S. sanctions to follow if Russia didn't agree to a ceasefire by August 8th. Slovenia has become the first EU country to ban arms trades with Israel. The Prime Minister says Palestinians are dying as aid is blocked and accuses Israel of serious breaches of international law. The move aims to put pressure on Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu to end the war in Gaza. And London Heathrow Airport has put forward a nearly €60 billion plan to expand. The proposal includes a third runway, a new terminal, and rerouting a major London motorway. Heathrow says the upgrade would nearly double passenger numbers to 150 million a year. London Mayor Sadiq Khan has told Monocle he is against the move.
I'm in favour of a better Heathrow, not a bigger one.
Those are the day's headlines. Back to you, Andrew.
Thank you, Laura. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Another still simmering frontline in President Trump's trade war with everybody is the one with China. When Trump first announced tariffs on the People's Republic and the European Union earlier this year, there was some wistful chat that this might bring the two entities closer together as trading partners. However, as the EU sees it, China has obdurately insisted on doing vexingly China variety stuff, supporting Russia's rampage in Ukraine and thereby Russia's wider threat to Europe, and undercutting EU produce around the world by subsidising overproduction. Well, I'm joined now by Lawrence Norman, Brussels Deputy Bureau Chief with the Wall Street Journal. Lawrence, wasn't this always likely to happen? Were the idea of, or was the idea of the EU and China suddenly becoming great trading partners always a bit optimistic?
Yeah, I would say probably it was. But let's just step back a second. I mean, the level of trade between the European Union and China is huge. They are very major trading blocs, and they do a lot of trade with each other and have done for many years, particularly countries like Germany and Sweden. So the idea was not that that they would start doing massive amounts of trade. That already existed. The idea was, would they come closer together, and particularly would the Europeans be able to resolve the issues they have with China on its trading practices under the threat of Trump? Some of us were pretty sceptical, and we proved to be right.
Have there been any improvements, though? I mean, those two big issues in particular, China's support for Russia in Ukraine and China subsidizing overproduction?
No, I think it's fair to say that the answer to that is no. Last week's summit between Chinese and EU leaders was polite, but it didn't make any headway on any issues. And in the lead up to the summit, as we wrote last week, there were all kinds of strains and all kinds of tensions expressed that ended up reducing the summit from 2 days to one. I mean, there were a couple of areas that the EU and China said that they would continue to work or try and work more closely. One is on climate issues and carbon emissions, and the other is some kind of mechanism that is supposed to allow the Europeans to more swiftly see and communicate where they have problems in getting access to the Chinese market. But whether that amounts to anything is anyone's guess. But the short answer to your question is no, there was no change.
But does the EU actually, in theory, have a carrot or stick big enough that it might alter China's behaviour on either of those fronts?
Well, again, the EU is one of the biggest markets for Chinese products in the world, in the top three. And there are certainly European products that the Chinese like to get. There are plenty of complaints that the Chinese companies have ripped off the technology behind those and started producing the products they were importing themselves. But this is a major trading partnership, and I think the Europeans were hopeful that they might get some better market access from the Chinese. But the fact of the matter is, for 4 or 5 years, they've had the same complaints: overproduction, obviously China's support for Russia, which is frankly not going to change, and I think they know it's not going to change. And then you've had new irritants, particularly around rare materials, raw minerals, which the Chinese will withheld from the Europeans as well as from the Americans. And this is not a trading relationship that is getting better.
Lawrence Norman with the Wall Street Journal in Brussels. Thanks for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. It is not news that in recent years Portugal has become an increasingly attractive destination for immigrants. What has been overlooked somewhat is that it has also been a pretty popular country to leave. It was the European country with the largest emigrant contingent as a proportion of population. That has changed. The latest figures from the Portuguese emigration report suggest that more Portuguese are electing to stay put, and that those who are leaving are swerving the previous most popular destination, the United Kingdom, in favour of Switzerland. Well, I'm joined now by a Portuguese person in the United Kingdom, Monocle's executive producer and senior foreign correspondent, Carlota Rebelo. First of all, Carlota, when Portuguese people were leaving, and I know there's a long history of emigration, but in recent years in particular, why were they going?
So I'll give you my own example, which was at the height of these numbers. So right now, the current numbers are around 70,000 Portuguese leaving per year. When I left back in 2012, 2013, the average there was 120,000. So nearly double. And at the time, we had one of the highest levels of youth unemployment in Europe. So you had a swathe of people graduating university and not being able to find a job. So economic motives have always been the biggest driver of emigration from Portugal. In previous generations, as you alluded to, in the 60s, 70s, we were in the midst of a dictatorship. So it was also not just economic reasons, but fleeing persecution and censorship from the dictatorship. And since then, a country that was trying to learn how to be a democracy. So usually it is economic drivers, because as you know, Portugal is one of the safest nations in the world. So it is not on that side.
So are there simple reasons why people now appear to be leaving in slightly lower numbers?
Yes. So going back to the economy, it is because our economy has improved and people identify that opportunities exist now back home, back in Portugal. I think as well, the past couple of years with the rise in remote working has allowed for people to rethink what international opportunities might look like. Beforehand, if you wanted to have an international career or work for abroad for an English-speaking company, for example, you would have to leave Portugal. Whereas now we know with the nature of remote working, that has changed massively. So it all comes back to the same factors. It comes back not just to economic opportunities, but a change in the job market and a change in how the country has fared over the past really 15 years and changed the investment it makes in its own people, the investment it has made in sectors such as technology and science, which really have helped to keep some of that talent at home and to get some people to come back too.
There is an obvious reason, starting with B, why the United Kingdom might have become a less attractive destination to your fellow Portuguese, but that doesn't explain the drift to Switzerland, which isn't in the European Union either, and is not the cheapest place in which somebody might want to start afresh.
Yes, but Switzerland historically has always had quite a big Portuguese immigrant population comparatively to the size of both nations. So to me, it doesn't surprise me that after the UK has, exited the scene, that Switzerland has now reached the top number. And if you think about it, both the UK back then and I guess Switzerland now are some of the richest, and were back then, some of the richest countries in the European Union, or the European Economic Zone at least. So when you are leaving your nation in search of better job opportunities as an economic migrant, it only makes sense that you are trying to go to the places where there is money.
And just finally, the number does still seem like a big one. I know all countries have a diaspora to a certain extent, but roughly a fifth of Portuguese people do not live in Portugal. Is this regarded as a big issue in Portuguese politics, or are governments a bit wary about what they would do to accommodate 2 million people if they all decided to come back home?
It is funny because every time there's a new government, the conversation goes back to how can we bring people back, revert the brain drain, etc. But I think deep down is more of the latter, like you alluded to, Andrew. But it is funny because every time there's a new election, that's when the issue of the 2 million Portuguese abroad comes up, because, we still vote for, of course, Portuguese president who represents all Portuguese, including the communities. We vote for MPs who represent the Portuguese communities abroad, even though there have been calls in recent years to change how many MPs, because it doesn't reflect the current numbers and how big that immigrant population has been. And a lot of us, I can include myself in that community, of course, as a Portuguese living abroad, do not feel our voice might be as heard as with the current number of MPs representing the immigrant contingent. But just going back to the numbers and the nations that have become top choice for Portugal, I was really surprised with these numbers, not with Switzerland and not with Spain, who have always ranked high, but the fact that in this top 10, Mozambique becomes one of the nations as well. So, of course, not a lot, is under 1,500, yes, immigrants. But if this number wasn't that high before, so I'm really curious in this push from the Portuguese immigrant community to go to Mozambique, and intrigued about what that might mean for the relationship between the CPLP and the two nations too.
Carlotta Rebello, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You are listening to The Briefing with me, Andrew Muller. It's time now for a wrap-up of the latest fashion news, and I am joined now in the studio in that endeavour by Monocle's fashion director, Natalie Theodosi. Natalie, it is not news that there is what is being referred to as a luxury slump, but there appears little sign of it unslumping, at least if Prada's experiences are anything to go by.
It's true, and it is to be expected, Andrew. I think there was a big boom in luxury during COVID when people had disposable income and time to spend browsing online shopping sites. But given the current economic landscape, the slowdown in China, the geopolitical tension that's happening, it is inevitable and everyone is experiencing it. But some companies more than others, and actually Prada is doing very well, I would say. I think some of our colleagues covering the latest numbers focused on the 2% drop in retail sales at Prada stores worldwide. But within the Prada group, there's been amazing resilience and a lot of growth happening. The sister label to Prada, which is Miu Miu, actually had a 49% 29% growth in sales, and it has been growing for the last 2-3 years, going against the luxury slowdown. And it's incredible to see how that company has grown. They've just bought Versace as well. So it's actually the Prada Group has really defied the odds and is doing extremely well. And it's a success case study, I would say.
So what has been their secret? If there is a slump, how do you do well when everybody else is doing badly?
I think you lean into creativity rather than playing it safe. And Miuccia Prada is one of the last designers of her generation, still very much active, and still she's working with a younger team. And for Prada, she has Raf Simons as her co-creative director, who's another great Belgian designer. But they don't play it safe, and they challenge the narrative whilst also being commercially savvy. So it's this really fine balance that they've managed to achieve. And also in terms of Miu Miu, I mean, the product has been growing and the collections, but also they have a whole host of events that they're doing, from literary clubs to bringing filmmakers together during Art Basel in Paris. And they've built a real community. And it's also a genuine exercise. It's not pure marketing. They're really interested in getting involved in culture, in supporting filmmakers and artists and authors, and they've built a community, and you really know what they're about. There's a slight intellectual edge to it, so I think that's their formula.
Well, let's look at a couple of the manufacturers which aren't doing as brilliantly. LVMH sales are down 9%. They're trying to find a buyer for Marc Jacobs.
Exactly. So Marc Jacobs is actually one of the brands that has turned around quite successfully after many years of challenge. And Marc Jacobs, the man, was pivotal in creating Louis Vuitton into what it is today, this mega brand. But it seems like it's a brand that has less potential for growth, and they're trying to sell it for $1 billion. So that's a way to get cash in and deal with the sales slowdown, which they are saying is very much a result of the slowdown in China and Japan as well.
Well, we seem to be proceeding in ascending order of difficulty. Gucci sales dropped down 25%, a 46% drop in Kering's group profits. Why have they struggled this much?
Yeah, you're right. It is a kind of descending order, with Kering being the group that is really struggling. I think Kering is a smaller group. So LVMH also has Moet Chandon. They are operating hotels, so they can the portfolio is a lot more diversified. Kering is reliant on the fashion brands, and all its star players, Gucci primarily, have had a really tough time. And I would say part of, especially when you look at Gucci, what has happened the last few years is that they've just doing really dramatic U-turns. So they went from Alessandro Michele, a very maximalist direction, to just completely doing a 180 and bringing someone else on board, changing the stores, changing the logos, the house color, everything, and expecting it to work within one season. That didn't work. Now there's another creative director coming on board, but rebrands take time, and it translates to the customer realizes that something is off, something keeps changing. Why should I keep shopping at Gucci? So the same has been happening at Balenciaga, at a lot of their main brands. I think Bottega Veneta was the only one which grew by 1%. So it will take some time. There's a lot of cost cutting. I think they're closing something like 80 stores by the end of the year, but they have a new CEO from Renault who's known for turnarounds, and he's known for cutting costs quite ruthlessly. So there is hope for a turnaround for Kering, just not in the near future.
Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion director, thank you for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Finally, on today's show, time for our weekly summer series where we tap Monocle's editors and leading contributors for their summer recommendations, from seasonal dishes and engrossing beach reads to magical vacation spots and elevated fashion tips. For this week's edition, Anita Riota sat down with Monocle Radio presenter and host of Meet the Writers, Georgina Godwin, to ask Georgina which books she recommends for your summer reads, picked from the authors she's interviewed. Georgina began by whisking us off to India for a book that has stood the test of time.
Oh, absolutely. So many. And it's quite difficult to cut them down. I think I'd probably start with a book that's 40 years old, which is extraordinary. But it was written at a time when this kind of material never came out of India, which is quite a straight-laced society even now. The book is called Paro, and it's written by Namita Gokhale. She runs the Jaipur Literary Festival. Since then, I think she's written sort of 25 more books or something. But Paro, subtitled Dreams of Passion, is about two very feisty women. It's very sexual. There's a lot of envy and jealousy and bad behaviour. So you can imagine the kind of storm it caused in India at the time. It's just been re-released as a Penguin modern classic because it's really been recognised as one of those books that stood the test of time. And very excitingly, within a couple of years, there's going to be a movie of it. Huge Bollywood movie. So this is a book to get in on the ground floor before the movie comes out because it's so much fun. And Namita, who wrote it, is just this amazing woman who runs this, what they call the greatest literary festival in the world in Jaipur. It's absolutely huge. And it's a brilliant, brilliant book.
Wow, I feel like we've started in such a big way, a fiery, sensual book. That's amazing. If we want to sort of deal with anything maybe more relaxed, something more to take our minds off of, maybe our many troubles the rest of the year, is there anything you have like that?
No.
Perfect.
What I do have is actually something that delves into really the zeitgeist of the moment. And this is about AI. And I'm not generally a fan of kind of horror or anything that's particularly scary. And this book's so good because you don't think it's going to be that. And it ends up being absolutely terrifying. It's called For Emma, and it's by the Scottish writer Ewan Morrison. I think it's his 5th or 6th book. And it's about this woman who works for an AI company, and they're doing various experiments on people's brains, trying to meld AI with humans. And this book kind of unfolds in this incredibly eerie way. It's so well written. It's such a brilliant book. And in fact, the Edinburgh Festival is coming up, the Edinburgh Literary Festival, and I'll be interviewing the author, Ewan Morrison. They're talking about this book For Emma because it's absolutely chilling. But at the same time, I mean, you might think that it's dystopian. It's not. I think we are closer to this than we imagine. So that's a bit scary.
Well, no, maybe another thing to sort of get in ahead of and brace yourselves, arm yourselves with this knowledge.
Absolutely. But if you did want to go for something a little bit more escapist, I wonder if you remember that film Hideous Kinky. It starred Kate Winslet. And it was about these little girls growing up in Morocco with their mothers, very much a free spirit. They were the children of Lucien Freud, their mother no longer with him, but she took the kids off to Morocco. And My Sister and Other Lovers is really the book that comes after that, although you can read it as a standalone. It's by Esther Freud, whose sister is Bella Freud, the fashion designer. And it still kind of carries on about their childhood, very, very unconventional childhood. Of course, daughters of this great artist, granddaughters of Sigmund Freud. And it's lovely. It really goes into the relationship between sisters and what love really means. And I was very, very happy with that.
Oh, that's beautiful. You have another book for us that has a familial tie. Could you tell us about that?
I do. It's very familial, and people on Monocle are probably sick of me mentioning it, but
no.
Honestly, I would be hounded out of my own family. I didn't say Exit Wounds by Peter Godwin. This is my brother's latest memoir, and it sort of looks at the last years of our mother's life, but also across back both of our lives, both in Zimbabwe, here in Britain, and his life in New York. It's kind of like a love letter to New York, actually, in lots of ways. And it's beautifully, beautifully written. It was very allegorical. People often say that they need to read it with a dictionary. I'm afraid my brother and I were often accused growing up of having swallowed dictionaries, and he's taken it, I think, pretty literally. But it's called Exit Wounds, and we have been on this incredible tour this year. We've been to something like 11 different cities all over the world promoting this book together. And we haven't finished yet. We're doing Edinburgh together. We'll be doing Charleston Literary Festival in South Carolina Carolina, and also a literary festival at sea, bizarrely, sailing on the Queen Mary from New York to Southampton. So he's written this book, Exit Wounds. And if you want to know anything about me, that's where you found out about it. And also Monocle. Monocle is in the book. So we talk about here and the studio and the very haunted graveyard next door. Now, I don't know if you know that. I use this now for the overnight people that come in. Just before I leave for the evening, I say to them, you do know about the huge plague pit next door and that 100,000 people are buried beneath this basement. Bye!
Bye, have a great evening. I love it. So we have done preparing for AI. We've investigated familial ties. We've done stories of passion. What is the final book you're leaving us with?
I would like to recommend Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones. And that is it's wonderful, isn't it? It comes from a Kashmiri saying that means something is very rare or very special. And it's by a Kashmiri writer, Priyanka Mattu. But she left Kashmir. Obviously, there's been so much strife there over the years, and they left pretty early on. And she ended up as a Hollywood talent agent representing mostly comedians. So she's very much a Hollywood insider. Her business partner is Jack Black, and she lives in LA with her husband and family. And this is her memoir about growing up. And it's actually a really lovely companion piece to Exit Wounds. That's how I got to know Priyanka. We all did an event together. And it's just beautifully written and really highlights a place in the world that I've not really given that much thought to, Kashmir, which sounds incredibly beautiful, but incredibly complicated. And again, just so beautifully written. It's her debut novel, and she is going to do so well with this book. And I very much expect that it will be a movie very soon.
That was Monocle Radio's own Georgina Godwin, host of Meet the Writers, in conversation with Anita Riota. You can catch new episodes of Meet the Writers every Sunday at midday UK time, or the whole catalogue wherever you get your podcasts. And that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Laura Kramer. Our researcher was Henry King, and our studio manager was Flynn Simons. The Briefing returns on Monday at the same time, midday London. I'm Andrew Muller. I'm back with The Daily at 1800. For now, goodbye. Thanks for listening.